towards the problems of minorities in the United States and underdeveloped countries in the rest of the world. Minorities in the United States and underdeveloped countries in the rest of the world. And it was to have an overt oppositional agenda. Not exactly the sort of thing you'd expect to go over big in San Diego in 1967 or 68. So they had no luck with the administration, and eventually occupied the administration building. And to do that, they had to get in the front door of the administration building, which was locked, and somebody broke the door so they could get in. And eventually they were, of course, expelled. These things always end. And the chancellor was very upset, he claimed, because the door had been broken. And he insisted that somebody has to pay for my door. And a few days later, a money order arrived. I think it was for $55, something like that, to replace the glass in the door. And there's an interview with the chancellor where he says, "I knew that was Herbert who sent me that money." So I think Marcuse was thinking, well, it's the people's property after all. You know, sometimes you have to break the door, but then you have to fix it. So eventually they did get a third college. It was named after a black hero, but not Patrice Lumumba. It was named after Thurgood Marshall, and it still exists. The second story about Marcuse and the student movement has to do with the May events in France. I was studying in France in 1967 and 68, and in May of 68, there was a conference on Marx at UNESCO, and Marcuse, along with scholars from many other countries, arrived to participate. And this just so happened to coincide with a student revolt that was starting up in Paris at the time. No one really knew what was going to happen in the early days of May, but it eventually grew to be the largest student movement in the history of the Western world. Hundreds of thousands of students participated, and eventually 10 million workers went on strike, closed down the whole country, and France was in chaos for a month, and they practically overthrew the government. So Marcuse was there at the beginning, and just before he arrived, a newspaper had published an article called the title, "Marcuse, Guru des étudiants en révolte." Marcuse, the guru of the students in revolt. So Marcuse was suddenly far more famous than he'd ever been before. And he wasn't used to it. When we arrived at UNESCO together that first day, journalists were clustering around him with TV cameras and tape recorders, and they all wanted interviews, and he looked really nervous. He was not happy with this at all. And one young journalist came up to me and he said, "The professor looks really unhappy. Maybe I can take him somewhere. I promise not to ask him any questions. I have a car." Turned out it was a fellow who later on became the leading right-wing news anchor in France, Jean-Pierre Elkabbach. But at the moment he was a young guy, and this looked like a fun thing to do, and we did it. I asked Marcuse, "Do you want to get out of here?" He said, "Yes, let's get out of here." So we got in the car, and Elkabbach said, "Where do you want to go?" And he said, "I want to meet the North Vietnamese delegation." And remember, the Paris peace talks had just begun in Paris, and so we drove to the Lutetia Hotel, and they sent down someone to talk to Marcuse. And a little guy came down, straight out of the jungle, I'm sure, and he opened the conversation by complimenting Marcuse on his great age, which didn't go over big. So they had an interesting discussion, and Marcuse told him, the one thing I remember clearly from the discussion was Marcuse saying, "Don't count on the American working class to end this war." He had already been convinced from far earlier, it's certainly clear in One-Dimensional Man, that the working class was no longer the agent of revolution you could count on in the wealthy Western countries. "Don't count on the American working class to end this war. Don't count on the American working class to end this war. Don't count on the American working class to end this war." So I don't think the Vietnamese needed this advice. They did pretty well without it.